Marilyn Monroe died on August 5, 1962. Within hours, the official narrative was set. Within days, the case was effectively closed. Within weeks, the investigation was over. But the questions did not end. They multiplied. And in the decades that followed, those questions became the subject of reviews, reinvestigations, and persistent public scrutiny. Some files were reopened, others were sealed. And the gap between what was officially concluded and what remains unanswered has never been bridged. This is not a story about what happened on the night Marilyn Monroe died. This is a story about what happened after. About the investigations that were launched and then abandoned. About the evidence that was collected and then lost. About the testimonies that were recorded and then contradicted. And about the questions that, more than 60 years later, still have no definitive answers. The initial response to Marilyn's death was swift but shallow. The Los Angeles Police Department conducted a preliminary investigation. Officers arrived at the scene. They interviewed witnesses. They documented the physical evidence. A report was filed. The coroner performed an autopsy. Toxicology tests were conducted. A ruling was made. Probable suicide. The case was closed. The entire process from death to official conclusion took less than 2 weeks. For many, that should have been the end of it. But almost immediately, inconsistencies began to surface. The timeline provided by witnesses did not align. Key details were missing from the police report. Evidence that should have been preserved was not. And as journalists, investigators, and members of the public began asking questions, the official response was silence. The case was closed, there was nothing more to say. But silence in the absence of clarity breeds suspicion. And suspicion, once rooted, is difficult to dispel. By the late 1960s, questions about Marilyn's death had moved from the margins to the mainstream. Books were published. Documentaries were made. Former officials began giving interviews in which they expressed doubt about the original findings. And pressure mounted for a more thorough examination of what had actually happened. In 1982, 20 years after Marilyn's death, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office conducted a formal review of the case. The review was prompted by a threshold document filed by a group of individuals who believed that new evidence warranted reopening the investigation. The threshold document cited inconsistencies in witness statements, missing evidence, and unanswered questions about the timeline of events on the night of Marilyn's death. The district attorney agreed to review the case, though not to reopen it as a criminal investigation. The review was led by Deputy District Attorney Ronald Carroll. Carroll and his team had access to the original police files, autopsy reports, and witness statements. They also conducted interviews with individuals who had been involved in the original investigation or who had since come forward with information. The review took several months. When it was completed, Carroll issued a report. The report acknowledged that the case contained numerous inconsistencies. It noted that key evidence had been lost or destroyed. It recognized that certain witnesses had provided conflicting accounts, but it concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support a finding of homicide. The case would remain closed. The 1982 review did not satisfy those who had called for it. Critics argued that the review was superficial, that it did not address the most troubling aspects of the case, that it relied too heavily on the original investigation, which many believed had been flawed from the start, and that it avoided asking the difficult questions about who might have had a motive to harm Marilyn and whether powerful individuals had influenced the investigation. One of the central issues raised in the 1982 review was the timeline. According to the official account, Marilyn was discovered dead sometime after 3 a.m. on August 5th. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, said she became concerned when she noticed a light under Marilyn's bedroom door. She called Dr. Ralph Greenson, who arrived and broke a window to enter the room. He found Marilyn unresponsive. He then called Dr. Hyman Engelberg, who pronounced her dead. The police were notified at 4:25 a.m., but multiple sources have suggested that this timeline is incorrect. Peter Lawford, who spoke to Marilyn by phone earlier that evening, later claimed that he became worried and contacted others, including Marilyn's attorney, Milton Rudin. According to some accounts, Murray and Greenson may have been at the house much earlier than they initially reported. If that is true, it raises an obvious question. Why was there a delay of several hours before the police were called? The 1982 review examined this issue but did not resolve it. The report noted that there were conflicting accounts about when Marilyn was discovered and when authorities were notified. It acknowledged that the delay, if it occurred, was unexplained. But it stopped short of concluding that the delay was evidence of a cover-up. The review suggested that confusion and poor recollection might account for the discrepancies. Critics found this explanation inadequate. Another issue examined in the 1982 review was the missing evidence. Toxicology samples that had been collected during the autopsy were never fully analyzed. They were reported missing before additional tests could be conducted. Phone records from Marilyn's home on the day of her death were subpoenaed, but were never produced. The phone company claimed they had been destroyed as part of routine maintenance. These gaps in the evidence made it impossible to answer certain questions definitively. The review also looked at the involvement of Robert Kennedy. Rumors had circulated for years that Kennedy, who was serving as Attorney General at the time, had been in Los Angeles on the day of Marilyn's death. Some witnesses claimed to have seen him near her home. Others suggested that he had visited her that day. Official records place Kennedy in Northern California, attending a meeting in San Francisco. But the 1982 review acknowledged that the question of Kennedy's whereabouts had not been thoroughly investigated in 1962. The review did not find evidence that Kennedy was in Los Angeles, but it also did not definitively rule it out. The role of the FBI also came under scrutiny. The Bureau had maintained a file on Marilyn Monroe. The file has been partially released through Freedom of Information Act requests, but large sections remain redacted. The released portions show that Marilyn was under surveillance because of her associations with individuals who were considered security risks during the Cold War. The file contains references to her social connections and mentions rumors about her relationships, but it does not contain evidence of a plot against her. The redacted sections have fueled speculation about what the FBI might have known or what it might have been involved in. The 1982 review concluded that while the case was problematic, it did not meet the legal standard required to reopen it as a homicide investigation. The report stated that the evidence, such as it was, did not support a conclusion that Marilyn had been murdered. It noted that the ruling of probable suicide, while not definitive, was the most consistent interpretation of the available facts. The review recommended that the case remain closed, and it has remained closed ever since. But the release of the 1982 report did not end public interest in the case. If anything, it intensified it. The acknowledgement that the original investigation had been flawed gave credibility to those who had been questioning the official narrative. And the decision not to reopen the case despite the acknowledged flaws suggested to some that there was a reluctance to pursue the truth. In the years following the 1982 review, additional information has come to light. Witnesses who had remained silent for decades have given interviews. Documents that were previously unavailable have been released. Investigative journalists and independent researchers have continued to examine the case. And each new revelation has added another layer to an already complex story. One of the most significant developments came in 1985, when Eunice Murray gave an interview to the BBC. During that interview, Murray admitted that the account she had given to police in 1962 was not entirely truthful. She said there were things she had been told not to say. She suggested that powerful people had influenced what could and could not be disclosed. When pressed for details, she became evasive. She hinted that Robert Kennedy had been at Marilyn's house on the day of her death, but she did not provide specifics. She did not name anyone directly, and she did not offer evidence to support her claims. Murray's interview was significant, not because it provided definitive answers, but because it confirmed what many had suspected, that the full story had not been told in 1962. Murray died in 1994, taking whatever additional knowledge she had with her. Her family has not released any private papers or diaries that might shed light on what she knew. Another figure who has added to the story is private investigator Milo Spiriglio. Spiriglio spent years researching Marilyn's death. He interviewed dozens of people who claimed to have information. He compiled his findings into a theory that Marilyn's death was not a suicide, but a homicide, carried out to prevent her from revealing damaging information about her relationships with the Kennedy brothers. Sparilio's work has been influential, but it has also been criticized. His conclusions rely heavily on anonymous sources and secondhand accounts. He never produced physical evidence to support his claims, and some of the individuals he cited have since been discredited. The question of what Marilyn knew and what she might have been planning to reveal is central to many of the theories about her death. If she had been involved romantically with John F. Kennedy or Robert Kennedy, and if she possessed information that could damage the Kennedy administration, her death would have been politically convenient. But no documentation has ever been found to prove such relationships existed. No letters, no recordings, no diary entries that definitively establish intimacy with either of the Kennedy brothers. There is also the matter of Marilyn's diary. Friends and colleagues have confirmed that Marilyn kept notes and wrote down her thoughts. After her death, no such diary was found among her belongings. The estate inventory did not mention it. Some have theorized that it was taken from her home before police arrived. Others believe it was destroyed. If the diary existed and contained sensitive information, its absence is significant. But without the diary itself, its contents can only be speculated upon. The FBI file on Marilyn Monroe has been a persistent source of speculation. The file exists, that much is confirmed. Portions of it have been released. Those portions show that Marilyn was monitored because of her political associations and her marriage to Arthur Miller, who had been investigated for alleged communist sympathies. But the file also contains redacted sections. Requests to have those sections declassified have been denied on national security grounds. Critics argue that there is no legitimate national security reason to keep information about a deceased actress classified more than 60 years after her death. Supporters of the redactions argue that the files may contain information about intelligence sources or methods that remain sensitive. The question of whether the redacted sections contain information relevant to Marilyn's death cannot be answered without access to them. It is possible that they contain nothing more than routine surveillance notes. It is also possible that they contain information that would shed light on the circumstances of her death. The refusal to release them has, predictably, fueled suspicion. In the decades since the 1982 review, no official body has reopened the investigation into Marilyn Monroe's death. The Los Angeles Police Department has not revisited the case. The District Attorney's Office has not conducted another review. The FBI has not declassified the remaining sections of its file. The case officially is closed, but unofficially it has never closed. Researchers continue to investigate. Documentaries continue to be made, books continue to be published, and the questions continue to be asked. What remains are the gaps, the missing phone records that might have shown who Marilyn spoke to in her final hours, the lost toxicology samples that might have clarified how the drugs entered her system, the conflicting witness statements that were never reconciled, the redacted FBI files that might contain relevant information, and the silence of those who were present and chose not to speak, or who spoke but did not tell the full truth. The story of the investigations into Marilyn Monroe's death is, in many ways, as significant as the story of her death itself. It is a story about how cases are closed not because all questions have been answered, but because the threshold for reopening them has not been met. It is a story about how evidence can be lost, destroyed, or withheld, and how the absence of evidence becomes its own kind of answer. And it is a story about how official conclusions, once issued, are difficult to challenge, even when they rest on an incomplete foundation. The decision to close a case is not always a decision about truth. It is often a decision about resources, about legal standards, and about what can be proven in a court of law. The 1982 review made clear that the standard for reopening Marilyn's case as a homicide investigation was high. It required new evidence that directly contradicted the original findings. It required proof, not suspicion. And it required a level of certainty that the available evidence did not provide. But the legal standard for reopening a case and the standard for believing that a case was inadequately investigated are not the same. Many who have examined Marilyn's death believe that the original investigation was flawed. They point to the lack of thorough interrogation of key witnesses. They note the failure to preserve critical evidence. They question the speed with which conclusions were reached. And they argue that the inconsistencies in the official account warrant further scrutiny, even if they do not meet the legal threshold for reopening the case. The families of those involved have largely remained silent. The Kennedy family has denied any romantic involvement between Marilyn and either John or Robert Kennedy. They have characterized the rumors as false and invasive. Dr. Greenson's family has not released his psychiatric notes on Marilyn, citing doctor-patient confidentiality. Dr. Engelberg's family has not provided additional information about his prescribing practices. And Eunice Murray's family has not released any private papers that might clarify her role. The absence of cooperation from those who might have information has made independent investigation difficult. Researchers are left to rely on public records, interviews with individuals who are now deceased, and documents that have been selectively released. The result is a fragmented picture with pieces that do not quite fit together. More than 60 years have passed since Marilyn Monroe died. The people who were there are gone. The evidence that might have resolved the questions has been lost or remains inaccessible. The official files are closed, and the truth, if it was ever fully known by anyone, has been carried to the grave by those who knew it. What remains is a case that refuses to close in the public mind, not because new evidence keeps emerging, but because the original evidence was never sufficient. Not because the official conclusion was necessarily wrong, but because it was reached too quickly and defended too rigidly. And not because the investigations that followed were thorough, but because they were constrained by the limitations of what could still be proven decades after the fact. The story of Marilyn Monroe's death is a story about what happens when the pursuit of truth is abandoned too soon, when evidence is not preserved, when witnesses are not pressed, when conclusions are accepted without challenge, and when the desire to close a case takes precedence over the need to answer the questions it raises. The files may be closed, but the questions remain. And as long as they remain, the case in every sense that matters is still open. The pattern repeats across the decades. Each time someone attempts to revisit the case, they encounter the same obstacles: missing evidence, uncooperative witnesses, sealed files, and a legal system that requires a level of proof that no longer exists. The 1982 review was not the last attempt to re-examine Marilyn's death, but it was the most comprehensive. Since then, journalists, researchers, and documentary filmmakers have continued to investigate. They have uncovered new testimonies. They have identified inconsistencies that were overlooked in earlier reviews. But they have not been able to produce the kind of evidence that would compel authorities to reopen the case. The question is no longer just what happened to Marilyn Monroe. The question is why the system designed to investigate her death failed so completely. Why evidence was not preserved. Why witnesses were not questioned thoroughly. Why files were closed before all avenues had been explored. And why, when those failures were acknowledged decades later, nothing was done to correct them. Part of the answer lies in the nature of the case itself. Marilyn's death occurred at a time when forensic science was less advanced. Prescription monitoring systems did not exist. Witness interviews were not recorded. Physical evidence was not always handled with the care that modern standards require. The investigators in 1962 were working with the tools and protocols available to them at the time. But even accounting for those limitations, the investigation was inadequate by the standards of its own era. Another part of the answer lies in the individuals involved. Marilyn was connected to powerful people. Her alleged relationships with the Kennedy brothers, whether real or rumored, created a political dimension that complicated the investigation. There were people who had an interest in ensuring that certain questions were not asked. And there were people who had the means to influence how those questions were answered. Whether that influence was exercised is a matter of interpretation. No smoking gun has been found. No document has surfaced that definitively proves the investigation was manipulated. But the circumstantial evidence, the missing phone records, the lost toxicology samples, the conflicting witness statements, the speed with which the case was closed, suggest that something more than incompetence was at work. The families of those involved have not helped to clarify the record. They have remained silent or defensive. They have invoked privacy, confidentiality, and the passage of time as reasons not to cooperate with researchers. And they have characterized the ongoing interest in Marilyn's death as exploitative and disrespectful. That position is understandable, but it has also ensured that questions remain unanswered. More than 6 decades have passed. The files are closed, the witnesses are dead, the evidence is gone. But the case has not ended. It exists now not in courtrooms or official reports, but in the public imagination. It is sustained by the questions that were never answered, by the gaps that were never filled, and by the knowledge that the truth, whatever it is, was not pursued with the diligence it deserved.